In a Riverside County courtroom, a homeless veteran in orange scrubs was about to face routine vagrancy charges. What started as another mundane Tuesday hearing took a shocking turn when Judge Abigail Washington discovered his military records. Benjamin Franklin Adams wasn't your typical defendant. For over a decade, he had served as an Army Special Forces medic, known for his Bronze Star heroism under fire. When he encountered the justice system's processing, he had no idea he was walking into a moment of recognition. Adams' quiet dignity would lead to a community transformation that changed how an entire county saw its forgotten heroes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above. Courtroom 3B, casting harsh shadows across the scarred wooden benches where a handful of defendants waited their turn before Judge Abigail Washington. Tuesday mornings were always the same, a parade of society's forgotten and fallen, cycling through the system with the mechanical precision of a factory conveyor belt. Judge Washington adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock. 9:30. She'd already processed 6 cases, 2 shoplifting charges, a public intoxication, a minor drug possession, and a couple of domestic disturbances. The coffee in her ceramic mug had gone cold an hour ago, but she took another sip anyway, the bitter taste matching her mood. "Next case," she called, her voice carrying the efficient detachment of someone who had seen it all in her 5 years on the bench. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. People versus Benjamin Franklin Adams, case number 2024 CR 8847. Judge Washington looked up as the defendant was escorted from the holding area. Orange County jail scrubs hung loose on his lean frame, and his graying hair was pulled back in, a neat ponytail despite his circumstances. There was something in his bearing, the way he held his shoulders, the measured pace of his steps, that caught her attention. Most defendants shuffled or swagger into her courtroom, but this man walked with purpose, even in shackles. Benjamin Franklin Adams stood before the bench and met her gaze directly. His eyes were clear, not bloodshot from alcohol or glazed from drugs like so many others who appeared before her. There was intelligence there, and something else, a quiet dignity that seemed incongruous with his current situation. "Mr. Adams," Judge Washington began, scanning the arrest report, "you're charged with vagrancy under Penal Code Section 647E and trespassing under Section 602. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was steady, respectful, but not subservient. In the gallery, Detective Betsy Ross Morgan shifted uncomfortably. She'd been the arresting officer, finding Adams sleeping in a downtown storefront doorway at 3 in the morning. Standard procedure for the homeless population that cycled through the system. But something about this arrest had been nagging at her since yesterday. Judge Washington flipped through the file, her routine review suddenly interrupted by a page that made her pause. Military service records. Her eyes scanned the details once, then again, her expression shifting from routine, boredom to focused attention. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Combat Medic Badge, 3 tours, Afghanistan 2003, 2004, Iraq 2005, 2006, Afghanistan again 2007, 2008. She looked up at the defendant with new eyes, studying his posture, the way he stood at attention without seeming to think about it. The bearing she'd noticed made sense now. "Mr. Adams," she said slowly, "according to these records, you served in the United States Army Special Forces." Something flickered across his face, not pride, but something more complex. Pain, perhaps, or shame. "Yes, ma'am." "These decorations." She paused, rereading the citations. "Bronze Star with Valor for heroic service in Afghanistan, Purple Heart, combat medic badge. Her voice caught slightly. Is this information accurate? Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Washington felt the weight of her father's memory pressing against her chest. Colonel Marcus Washington, 82nd Airborne, 2 tours in Vietnam, who had passed just 6 months ago. She remembered his stories about coming home to a country that didn't want to see its veterans, about good men who fell through the cracks. Bailiff, she said, her voice carrying new authority, I need to verify this information. Court clerk, please contact the Department of Defense Records Office. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted. The public defender looked up from his phone, suddenly interested. Detective Morgan leaned forward in her seat, studying Adams with fresh eyes. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned with confirmation. The records were accurate. Benjamin Franklin Adams, Staff Sergeant, Army Special Forces, medically retired, with full honors. The Bronze Star citation detailed how he had exposed himself to enemy fire to treat and evacuate 6 wounded soldiers during a Taliban ambush in Kandahar province. Judge Washington set down the papers and looked at the man before her bench. Here was a hero, someone who had bled for his country, who had saved lives under fire, standing in her courtroom in orange jail scrubs, charged with the crime of having nowhere to sleep. Mr. Adams, she said, her voice softer now, can you tell the court about your current living situation? Ben's composure wavered for the first time. I've been between housing arrangements for about 2 years, Your Honor. You're homeless. He nodded, unable to speak the word himself. In the gallery, Detective Morgan felt something twist in her stomach. 2 years. She'd been arresting homeless individuals for vagrancy and trespassing for 8 years, processing them through the system like statistics. How many other veterans had she failed to see? Judge Washington removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Her grandfather had fought in World War II, her father in Vietnam. Her brother was currently serving in Afghanistan. Military service was woven into the fabric of her family's identity, and the idea that this decorated veteran was sleeping in doorways while she sent him through the system like any other vagrant felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe. Mr. Adams, I'm going to postpone this hearing for 2 weeks while I consider the circumstances of your case. She paused, knowing she was stepping outside normal judicial procedure, but unable to stop herself. In the meantime, you're released on your own recognizance. The public defender looked surprised. Detective Morgan sat back in her seat, a mix of relief and guilt washing over her. Ben Adams stood motionless for a moment, as if processing what had just happened. Thank you, Your Honor. As the bailiff removed his shackles, Judge Washington watched this forgotten hero prepare to walk back out onto the streets. The system had failed him, and she had nearly failed him too. But something had shifted in that courtroom, a recognition that demanded action. The gavel came down, but Judge Washington knew this case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Judge Washington's gavel echoed in the now empty courtroom, but she remained seated, staring at the military service records spread before her. The fluorescent light seemed harsher now, illuminating details that painted a picture of heroism. She couldn't reconcile with the man who had just walked out in ill-fitting civilian clothes donated by the county. She picked up her phone and dialed the Veterans Affairs Office. While waiting for someone to answer, her mind drifted to her father's funeral 6 months ago, the folded flag, the 21-gun salute, the way the honor guard had handed her, that triangle of red, white, and blue with such reverence. Veterans Affairs, how may I help you? This is Judge Abigail Washington, Riverside County Municipal Court. I need to speak with someone about a veteran named Benjamin Franklin Adams. 2 hours earlier, before dawn had broken over the Kandahar province, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Adams had been checking his medical supplies when the first RPG screamed overhead. The compound shook, dust raining from the ceiling as he grabbed his aid bag, and followed his squad leader toward the perimeter. The memory hit Ben like a physical blow as he walked down the courthouse steps. 20 years had passed, but the smell of cordite and blood seemed to fill his nostrils. His hands began to shake, the same hands that had once steadied under enemy fire to save lives. He forced himself to breathe, using the techniques Dr. Morrison at the VA had taught him during his brief stint in therapy 2 years ago. Before, the money ran out before he stopped showing up because he couldn't afford the bus fare. Focus on the present, he told himself. The courthouse steps, the California sun, not the Afghan dust. But the judge's questions had torn open something he'd kept buried. The way she'd said Bronze Star with valor, with respect, with recognition. No one had spoken about his service that way since before everything fell apart. The firefight had lasted 4 hours. Ben remembered every detail with the clarity that trauma burns into memory. Rodriguez taking shrapnel in his leg. Williams screaming for his mother as Ben worked to stop the bleeding from his abdominal wound. The weight of Peterson's body as Ben dragged him to cover, already knowing it was too late. But it was the IED on the way back to base that changed everything. The Humvee in front of his had triggered it, and Ben watched his world explode in slow motion, metal, flying bodies thrown like ragdolls, the ringing in his ears that would never fully go away. He'd been the only one in his squad to walk away from that blast. 6 good men, better men than him, he'd always believed, gone in an instant while he survived with nothing more than a concussion and shrapnel scars on his arms. Detective Betsy Ross Morgan sat in her patrol car outside the courthouse, engine running, but going nowhere. She'd watched Ben Adams walk down those steps, and something about his careful, measured gait reminded her of her own father returning from his second deployment. The way he held himself upright, despite carrying invisible weight. She pulled out her phone and opened the database, typing in Adams' name. The arrest record was thin. This was only his second vagrancy charge in 2 years. Most homeless individuals cycled through the system monthly, sometimes weekly. Adams had been trying to stay invisible. Her radio crackled. Unit 47, respond to disturbance at 5th and Main. Unit 47 en route, she replied automatically, but her thoughts remained with the decorated veteran she'd arrested for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. Judge Washington was still on hold with the VA when her clerk knocked. Your Honor, I have Colonel Prudence Revere on line 2. She says it's about Benjamin Adams. Washington's eyebrows rose. She'd never heard of Colonel Revere, but the fact that a colonel was calling about Ben suggested his story ran deeper than even his service records indicated. Colonel Revere, this is Judge Washington. Your Honor, I understand you've encountered one of my former soldiers. The voice was crisp, authoritative, but carried an undercurrent of concern. Staff Sergeant Adams served under my command in Afghanistan. If he's in trouble, I need to know. He's not in trouble exactly, but he's homeless, Colonel, living on the streets. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Washington wondered if the call had dropped. Colonel, I'm here. The voice was quieter now. I've been afraid of this. Adams was one of the finest soldiers I've ever commanded, but he came home broken. We all did to some extent, but Ben, he couldn't forgive himself for surviving when his squad didn't. Ben found himself walking toward the river that ran through downtown Riverside. It was a place he came when the memories got too loud, when the present felt too heavy to bear. The water moved with purpose, unlike his own directionless existence. He sat on a concrete embankment and pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet, the only possession he'd managed to keep through 2 years of homelessness. 6 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. His squad, his brothers, Rodriguez, 22, who'd wanted to be a teacher, Williams, 19, who collected comic books and sent half his pay to his grandmother, Peterson, the squad clown who could make anyone laugh, even in the worst situations. Martinez, the quiet one who spoke fluent Pashto and bridged cultural gaps. Thompson, their radio operator who never missed a call home to his pregnant wife. Jackson, their squad leader, who'd covered for Ben's mistakes when he was still learning. All dead because they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time while he'd been in the right place to survive. Back in her chambers, Judge Washington hung up with Colonel Revere and immediately called Dr. Samuel Hancock at the VA hospital. She'd met Doc Hancock at a veterans benefit dinner, a gruff Vietnam veteran who'd turned his own struggles with PTSD into a mission to help other combat veterans. "Doc, it's Abigail Washington. I need your help with the situation." As she explained Ben's case, Washington found herself thinking about justice, not the mechanical processing of cases that filled her days, but real justice. The kind that recognized that some wounds weren't visible, that some debts could never be repaid, and that sometimes the system needed to bend to serve those who had already bent to serve their country. Ben Adams had saved 6 lives under enemy fire. Now it was time for someone to save his. Judge Washington's phone call with Dr. Hancock had ended with a plan that broke every protocol in her judicial handbook. She sat in her chambers, staring at her father's Purple Heart displayed on the bookshelf, a reminder of service, sacrifice, and the duty to care for those who'd answered their country's call. 20 minutes later, she made a decision that would have shocked her colleagues. She cancelled her afternoon docket, changed out of her robes, and drove her personal car to the courthouse parking lot where Ben Adams sat on a bench, looking lost in a world that had moved on without him. "Mr. Adams," she called, approaching with the careful respect she'd learned growing up in a military family. Ben looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Your Honor, is everything all right? I was wondering if you'd allow me to drive you somewhere. There's someone I'd like you to meet." The VA hospital sat like a fortress of beige concrete and good intentions on the outskirts of Riverside. Ben hadn't been inside in 2 years, not since his last failed attempt at getting help. The bureaucracy had defeated him then. Endless forms, long waits, appointments that led to more appointments but never to actual assistance. Judge Washington pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. "Dr. Samuel Hancock is expecting us. He's someone who understands." Ben's hands clenched involuntarily. "Your Honor, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been through this before. The system isn't designed for people like me." "People like you?" Washington's voice carried an edge. "You mean decorated combat veterans who saved lives under fire?" The directness of her words hit Ben like a physical blow. He wasn't used to people seeing past his current circumstances to what he'd once been. They walked through the sliding glass doors into the sterile brightness of the VA lobby. The smell, antiseptic mixed with industrial cleaning products, triggered memories Ben had spent years trying to suppress. Field hospitals, medevac choppers, the metallic taste of fear. Dr. Samuel Hancock appeared in the lobby before they'd even approached the reception desk. He was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. But what struck Ben immediately was the way the doctor moved, with the careful precision of someone whose body carried old wounds. "Staff Sergeant Adams," Doc Hancock said, extending his hand. "Not Mr. Adams or Benjamin. The rank, the recognition." Ben found himself straightening, his hand moving automatically to return what was almost a salute before catching himself. "Sir, none of that sir business. I work for a living." Doc's smile was genuine, carrying the easy camaraderie of shared experience. "I was Navy Corpsman, Vietnam. Different war, same scars." While Judge Washington facilitated Ben's entry into the VA system, Detective Morgan was conducting her own investigation 20 miles away in downtown Riverside. She'd driven to the storefront where she'd arrested Ben, trying to understand what had led a decorated veteran to sleep in doorways. The area was a maze of narrow alleys and abandoned buildings, the forgotten spaces where society's invisible population tried to exist. Morgan had patrolled these streets for 8 years, but she'd never really seen them, not like this. "You looking for Ben?" Morgan turned to find a man watching her from the shadows between 2 buildings. He was compact and wiry, with the kind of tan that came from living outside, and eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Detective Morgan. I arrested him yesterday." "Yeah, I know." The man stepped forward, his movements careful, but not afraid. "Name's Thomas Hamilton. Folks call me Ghost." Morgan studied him, noting the military bearing that seemed to define all of Ben's associates. "Your Navy?" "Was. Submarine service. Been topside for 5 years now." Ghost's smile was sardonic. "Ben mentioned me?" "Should he have?" Ghost gestured toward a small encampment hidden behind a chain-link fence. Tarps stretched between shopping carts created makeshift shelters. An older woman sorted through a bag of canned goods, while a man with a prosthetic leg organized blankets. "See Martha there? 82 years old. Vietnam War nurse. That's Carlos with the leg. Lost it in Fallujah. Ben makes sure they eat. Make sure they're safe. Make sure the predators who prey on folks like us know there's consequences." Morgan felt something shift in her understanding. He protects them. More than that. When Martha got pneumonia last winter, Ben carried her 6 blocks to the emergency room. When Carlos couldn't get his prosthetic adjusted at the VA, Ben found a way to get it fixed. When some punk kids decided homeless folks made good target practice with paintball guns, Ben had a conversation with them that changed their perspective. Ghost led her deeper into the encampment, where she saw evidence of organization that spoke to military training. Supplies neatly sorted. Clear sightlines, multiple exit routes. This wasn't random homelessness. This was a tactical position established by someone who understood security. "Ben never talks about what he did over there," Ghost continued, "but we all know. You can see it in how he moves, how he thinks, how he can't stand to see people suffer when he has the power to help." Back at the VA, Ben sat across from Dr. Hancock in an office that looked more like a living room than a medical facility. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, pictures of dogs and grandchildren on the desk. "Tell me about the nightmares," Doc said without preamble. Ben's jaw tightened. "Who says I have nightmares? Combat veteran with PTSD who's been self-medicating with alcohol and avoiding human connection for 3 years. Lucky guess." Doc leaned back in his chair. "I've been having the same nightmare for 47 years. Mekong Delta. Kid stepped on a mine right in front of me. Nothing I could do, but that doesn't stop my brain from replaying it every few nights, trying to find a way to save him." The honesty was like a key turning in a lock Ben had kept sealed for years. "My squad, the IED. I should have seen it, should have been in that vehicle. Should have died with your brothers." Doc's voice was gentle but firm. "I know. Survivor's guilt is its own special kind of hell." Ben looked up, meeting the older man's eyes for the first time. How do you live with it?" "By helping other people live with it. By understanding that my survival isn't an accident. It's a responsibility." Doc leaned forward. "You've been taking care of people on the streets, haven't you? Making sure the vulnerable are protected." Ben nodded reluctantly. "Same instinct that made you a good medic. You see suffering, you respond. The only difference is now you think you don't deserve help yourself." Doc's smile was understanding. "Well, Staff Sergeant, I'm here to tell you that's bullshit, and we're going to prove it." Judge Washington drove Ben back toward downtown. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, neither spoke for several minutes. both processing what had happened at the VA. "Dr. Hancock seems to understand," Ben finally said. "He should. He's been where you are." Washington glanced at him. "The question is whether you're ready to let people help you." Ben stared out the window at the familiar streets where he'd been invisible for 2 years. "I'm not sure I remember how to be helped." "Then maybe it's time to learn." As they reached the courthouse where Ben's journey had begun just hours earlier, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but more than that, the wheels of compassion, recognition, and community had begun to turn. Ben Adams was no longer invisible, and that changed everything. Judge Washington's phone call with Dr. Hancock had ended with a plan that broke every protocol in her judicial handbook. She sat in her chambers, staring at her father's Purple Heart displayed on the bookshelf, a reminder of service, sacrifice, and the duty to care for those who'd answered their country's call. 20 minutes later, she made a decision that would have shocked her colleagues. She cancelled her afternoon docket, changed out of her robes, and drove her personal car to the courthouse parking lot where Ben Adams sat on a bench, looking lost in a world that had moved on without him. "Mr. Adams," she called, approaching. With the careful respect she'd learned growing up in a military family, Ben looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Your Honor, is everything all right? I was wondering if you'd allow me to drive you somewhere. There's someone I'd like you to meet." The VA hospital sat like a fortress of beige concrete and good intentions on the outskirts of Riverside. Ben hadn't been inside in 2 years, not since his last failed attempt at getting help. The bureaucracy had defeated him then. Endless forms, long waits, appointments that led to more appointments, but never to actual assistance. Judge Washington pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. "Dr. Samuel Hancock is expecting us. He's someone who understands." Ben's hands clenched involuntarily. "Your Honor, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been through this before. The system isn't designed for people like me." "People like you?" Washington's voice carried an edge. "You mean decorated combat veterans who saved lives under fire?" The directness of her words hit Ben like a physical blow. He wasn't used to people seeing past his current circumstances to what he'd once been. They walked through the sliding glass doors into the sterile brightness of the VA lobby. The smell, antiseptic mixed with industrial cleaning products, triggered memories Ben had spent years trying to suppress. Field hospitals, medevac choppers, the metallic taste of fear. Dr. Samuel Hancock appeared in the lobby before they'd even approached the reception desk. He was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. But what struck Ben immediately was the way the doctor moved, with the careful precision of someone whose body carried old wounds. "Staff Sergeant Adams," Doc Hancock said, extending his hand. Not Mr. Adams or Benjamin, the rank, the recognition. Ben found himself straightening, his hand moving automatically to return what was almost a salute before catching himself. "Sir." "None of that sir business. I work for a living." Doc's smile was genuine, carrying the easy camaraderie of shared experience. "I was Navy corpsman, Vietnam. Different war, same scars." While Judge Washington facilitated Ben's entry into the VA system, Detective Morgan was conducting her own investigation 20 miles away in downtown Riverside. She'd driven to the storefront where she'd arrested Ben, trying to understand what had led a decorated veteran to sleep in doorways. The area was a maze of narrow alleys and abandoned buildings, the forgotten spaces where society's invisible population tried to exist. Morgan had patrolled these streets for 8 years, but she'd never really seen them. Not like this. "You looking for Ben?" Morgan turned to find a man watching her from the shadows between 2 buildings. He was compact and wiry, with the kind of tan that came from living outside and eyes that missed nothing. I'm Detective Morgan. I arrested him yesterday. Yeah, I know. The man stepped forward, his movements careful, but not afraid. Name's Thomas Hamilton. Folks call me Ghost. Morgan studied him, noting the military bearing that seemed to define all of Ben's associates. Your Navy. Was submarine service. Been topside for 5 years now. Ghost's smile was sardonic. Ben, mention me? Should he have? Ghost gestured toward a small encampment, hidden behind a chain-link fence. Tarps stretched between shopping carts created makeshift shelters. An older woman sorted through a bag of canned goods, while a man with a prosthetic leg organized blankets. See Martha there, 82 years old, Vietnam War nurse. That's Carlos with the leg, lost it in Fallujah. Ben makes sure they eat, make sure they're safe, make sure the predators who prey on folks like us know there's consequences. Morgan felt something shift in her understanding. He protects them. More than that. When Martha got pneumonia, last winter, Ben carried her 6 blocks to the emergency room. When Carlos couldn't get his prosthetic adjusted at the VA, Ben found a way to get it fixed. When some punk kids decided homeless folks made good target practice with paintball guns, Ben had a conversation with them that changed their perspective. Ghost led her deeper into the encampment, where she saw evidence of organization that spoke to military training. Supplies neatly sorted, clear sight lines, multiple exit routes. This wasn't random homelessness. This was a tactical position, established by someone who understood security. Ben never talks about what he did over there, Ghost continued, but we all know you can see it in how he moves, how he thinks, how he can't stand to see people suffer when he has the power to help. Back at the VA, Ben sat across from Dr. Hancock in an office that looked more like a living room than a medical facility. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, pictures of dogs and grandchildren on the desk. Tell me about the nightmares, Doc said without preamble. Ben's jaw tightened. Who says I have nightmares? Combat veteran with PTSD who's been self-medicating. With alcohol and avoiding human connection for 3 years? Lucky guess. Doc leaned back in his chair. I've been having the same nightmare for 47 years. Mekong Delta. Kids stepped on a mine right in front of me. Nothing I could do, but that doesn't stop my brain from replaying it every few nights, trying to find a way to save him. The honesty was like a key turning in a lock Ben had kept sealed for years. My squad. The IED. I should have seen it. Should have been in that vehicle. Should have died with your brothers. Doc's voice was gentle but firm. I know. Survivor's guilt is its own special kind of hell. Ben looked up, meeting the older man's eyes for the first time. How do you live with it? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By helping other people live with it, by understanding that my survival isn't an accident, it's a responsibility. Doc leaned forward. You've been taking care of people on the streets, haven't you? Making sure the vulnerable are protected? Ben nodded reluctantly. Same instinct that made you a good medic. You see suffering, you respond. The only difference is now you think you don't deserve help yourself. Doc's smile was understanding. Well, Staff Sergeant, I'm here to tell you that's bullshit, and we're going to prove it. Judge Washington drove Ben back toward downtown. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, neither spoke for several minutes, both processing what had happened at the VA. Dr. Hancock seems to understand, Ben finally said. He should. He's been where you are. Washington glanced at him. The question is whether you're ready to let people help you. Ben stared out the window at the familiar streets where he'd been invisible for 2 years. I'm not sure I remember how to be helped. Then maybe it's time to learn. As they reached the courthouse where Ben's journey had begun just hours, Earlier, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but more than that, the wheels of compassion, recognition, and community had begun to turn. Ben Adams was no longer invisible, and that changed everything. Martha Jefferson Clark had been monitoring the courthouse scanner for 3 hours when she caught the story that would change her career. As the newest reporter at KRSV News, she spent her days chasing fender benders and city council meetings, desperately searching for the human interest. Piece that would prove she belonged in the newsroom alongside veterans twice her age. The call came from Janet in the courthouse clerk's office, a source Martha had been cultivating with coffee and genuine interest in Janet's grandchildren. "You might want to look into that Adams case from this morning. Judge Washington did something unusual." Martha's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up court records, Benjamin Franklin Adams, vagrancy charges. But as she dug deeper, cross-referencing military databases her journalism professor had taught her to access, her eyes widened. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, 3 combat tours. "Jesus," she whispered, then immediately thought of her. Brother Marcus, currently deployed with the 82nd Airborne. How many nights had she lain awake, wondering if he'd come home changed, broken, forgotten, like so many others? 2 hours later, Martha stood outside the VA hospital, having traced Ben's movements through the careful cultivation of sources. She'd learned that Judge Washington had personally driven him here, a breach of protocol that suggested this story ran deeper than routine court proceedings. She waited in the parking lot, wrestling with her approach. Her journalism professors had drilled into her the importance of getting the story, but her brother's deployment had taught her that veterans deserved respect, not exploitation. When Ben emerged with Judge Washington, Martha approached carefully. "Mr. Adams, I'm Martha Clark from KRSV News. I wonder if I could speak with you about what happened in court today." Ben's entire body tensed, his eyes scanning for escape routes with the automatic assessment of someone who'd survived in hostile territory. "I don't have anything to say." "I understand," Martha said, her voice gentle, "but I think your story matters. My brother's in Afghanistan right now, and I keep wondering what happens to soldiers when they come home, when the system forgets them." Something in her tone made Ben pause. Judge Washington stepped forward protectively, but Ben held up a hand. "Your brother?" "Staff Sergeant Marcus Clark, 82nd Airborne, 2nd deployment." Martha's voice caught slightly. "I worry about him coming back to a country that doesn't see its veterans unless they're homeless in doorways." Ben studied her face, seeing genuine concern rather than opportunistic hunger. "Where's he stationed?" "Bagram. He's a medic." The word hit Ben like a physical blow. Another medic. Another young man trying to save lives in an impossible situation. How old? 24. The same age Ben had been during his first tour, before he learned that saving some people meant watching others die, before he understood that coming home could be harder than staying at war. "One interview," Ben said finally, "but not here and not about the details." They met at a small coffee shop downtown, away from the clinical environment of the VA. Martha had done her research in the intervening hours, discovering the scope of veteran homelessness in Riverside County. The statistics were staggering. Over 300 homeless veterans in a county that barely acknowledged the problem. "Tell me about the transition," Martha said, her recorder between them but forgotten. "What happens when you come home?" Ben wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, using the warmth to anchor himself in the present. "You spend months, years, learning to be a soldier, learning to think like a warrior, learning to make life and death decisions in seconds." He paused. "Then you come home, and nobody teaches you how to be a civilian again." "The nightmares?" "Some nights I'm back in Kandahar. Some nights I'm trying to save people who are already dead. Some nights..." He stopped, unable to continue. Martha leaned forward, her reporter's instincts balanced against human compassion. "Some nights you wish you hadn't come home at all." Ben's eyes met hers, and she saw the depth of pain he carried. Survivor's guilt is a full-time job. You spend every day wondering why you're here when better people aren't. But you are here, and from what I've learned, you've been using that survival to help other people. Ben's surprised expression told Martha she'd struck something important. "Ghost told you about the camps. He told me about community, about a decorated combat veteran who could have disappeared entirely but chose to protect the most vulnerable, people in the city." For the next hour, Martha listened as Ben talked about his unconventional family, veterans and civilians alike, who lived in the shadows of a society that preferred not to see them. He spoke of Martha the nurse, Carlos with his prosthetic leg, elderly veterans who'd fought in Vietnam and found themselves discarded by the country they'd served. "They deserve better," Ben said finally. "We all do." The story aired at 6 o'clock that evening, during prime time when families across Riverside County were settling down for dinner. Martha had crafted it carefully, focusing not on pity, but on dignity, not on failure, but on service continued in different form. Tonight, we introduce you to Staff Sergeant Benjamin Adams, a decorated combat veteran whose Bronze Star citation reads like something from a movie. But Sergeant Adams isn't in a movie. He's been living on our streets for 2 years, part of a hidden community of veterans who fell through the cracks of a system that promised to catch them. The piece included her interview with Ben, interspersed with statistics about veteran homelessness and commentary from Dr. Hancock about the challenges facing returning soldiers. But the heart of the story was Ben himself, articulate, dignified, carrying invisible wounds with the same courage he'd shown under enemy fire. Within an hour of broadcast, the station's phones began ringing. Social media exploded with shares, comments, and offers of help. The story had struck a nerve in a community that hadn't realized how many of its heroes were struggling in silence. But Ben, watching from the small room the VA had provided for the night, felt the walls closing in. The attention he'd avoided for 2 years was now focused on him, like a spotlight, and every instinct told him to run. His phone, a basic model Ghost had helped him get, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the story. So proud of you. Love, M." Mercy, his ex-wife, had seen the broadcast, which meant Liberty might have seen it too. The thought of his daughter watching her homeless father on television made Ben's chest tighten with panic. He'd worked so hard to stay invisible, to protect her from the reality of what he'd become. Now that protection was gone, shattered by good intentions and media attention he'd never wanted. As notifications continued to light up his phone and the weight of sudden visibility pressed down on him, Ben understood that his careful anonymity was over. For better or worse, he was visible again. The question was whether he could survive being seen. The notification sound on Mercy Adams' phone cut through the quiet evening in her Sacramento apartment like a blade. She was grading papers at the kitchen table, 8th grade English essays about heroes and courage that now seemed painfully ironic, when her sister's text arrived with a link and 3 words. "You need to see this." Liberty looked up from her homework spread across the living room coffee table. At 14, she had learned to read her mother's expressions with the precision of someone who'd grown up in a house where unspoken tension lived in every corner. "Mom, what's wrong?" Mercy's hands trembled as she clicked the link, and Ben's face filled her phone screen. Older, weathered, but unmistakably the man she'd married 12 years ago, the man she'd loved, the man she'd left. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Adams, a decorated combat veteran whose Bronze Star citation reads like something from a movie. The words washed over her as the camera captured Ben's quiet dignity, his careful way of speaking, the pain he carried. in his eyes that she remembered so well. 2 years, 2 years since she'd changed her phone number, since she'd moved to Sacramento, since she'd built a wall between her daughter and the father whose nightmares had once filled their house with screams. "Mom!" Liberty's voice was closer now. She'd moved from the couch, drawn by her mother's stillness. Mercy looked up to find her daughter standing beside her chair and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She turned the phone so Liberty could see. "This is your father." Liberty stared at the screen, watching this stranger who shared her dark eyes and stubborn chin. She'd seen exactly 3 photographs of her father, carefully selected images from before his deployment when his smile reached. His eyes and his arms could hold her without shaking. This man looked different, older, broken in ways that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. But when he spoke about protecting other veterans, about taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, she heard something familiar, an echo of the bedtime stories her mother used to tell about a brave soldier who saved people. "He's homeless," Liberty said, the word foreign in her mouth. She'd never known anyone who was homeless. It was an abstract concept from news stories and school presentations about social issues. "He's sick, honey." Mercy's voice was carefully controlled, the same tone she used when explaining difficult concepts to her students. "He came back from the war changed. And we couldn't help him. But he won medals. The reporter said he saved people. He did save people. He saved a lot of people." Mercy closed her eyes, remembering nights when Ben would wake up screaming names she didn't recognize, reaching for medical supplies that weren't there, trying to save soldiers who existed only in his nightmares. But he couldn't save himself. Liberty watched the rest of the news story in silence, absorbing details about veteran homelessness, about systems that failed the people who'd served their country. When it ended, she looked at her mother with an expression that was too old. For her, 14 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question Mercy had been dreading for 2 years. "Because I was trying to protect you from being hurt again." Again. Mercy realized her mistake immediately. Liberty had been 9 when they'd left Ben, young enough to accept the simplified explanation that Daddy was sick and couldn't live with them anymore. Old enough to remember the good times, but not old enough to understand the bad ones. "He tried to get better, sweetheart. He went to doctors, took medicine, went to counseling. But some nights he would think he was still at war. He would wake up and not know where he was. And he would." Mercy struggled for words that could explain trauma to a child. "He would scare us without meaning to." Liberty absorbed this information with the frightening maturity of a child who'd grown up with questions she wasn't allowed to ask. "Where is he now?" 200 miles south, Colonel Prudence Revere was packing a bag in her San Diego apartment. The news story had been sent to her by 3 different people, and each viewing had hit her like a physical blow. She'd commanded Ben Adams for 18 months in Afghanistan, had pinned the Bronze Star on his chest herself, had written the recommendation that detailed how he'd exposed himself to enemy fire to treat 6 wounded soldiers, how he'd worked for 4 hours under a makeshift tent during a sandstorm to save 2 men who shouldn't have survived. She'd also signed his medical discharge papers, had watched him walk away from the base with the hollow expression of someone whose war would never really end. And then, like too many of her soldiers, she'd lost track of him in the bureaucratic maze of veteran services and civilian transition. The guilt was a familiar weight in her chest. She'd commanded men and women in combat, had been responsible for their lives under fire. But somehow she'd failed them in peace, failed to stay connected, failed to ensure they were cared for, failed to honor the promise every officer makes to their soldiers, that their service matters, that they matter. She'd tried to find some of them over the years. Rodriguez had become a teacher, like he'd always planned. Williams had opened a small mechanic shop. But too many others had simply vanished into a civilian world that didn't know how to value what they'd given, Now she knew where Ben Adams was, and she knew what she had to do. Dolly Madison Wright had been watching the morning news in her cramped office when Martha Clark's story aired, and the images on screen transported her back 23 years to a moment that had defined her life. Her father, Colonel James Wright, Vietnam veteran, lying on a gurney in the county morgue, homeless, forgotten, dead from exposure on a cold December night because the system he'd served had failed to catch him when he fell. She'd built her entire career around that failure, first as a social worker navigating the bureaucratic maze that swallowed veterans whole, then as the founder of Riverside Veterans Advocacy, a grassroots organization that existed in the gaps where government programs fell short. Now, watching Ben Adams speak with quiet dignity about protecting the forgotten, she saw an opportunity that transcended individual rescue. This was the story that could crack open public consciousness, that could transform outrage into action. She picked up her phone and started making calls. The panic attack hit Ben at 3 a.m, 6 days after the town hall meeting. He'd been dreaming about Rodriguez again, young, scared, bleeding out in the Afghan dust, while Ben tried desperately to find the hole in his femoral artery. But this time, when he looked up from his patient, he saw the faces from the community, center staring down at him with expectation and hope that felt heavier than enemy fire. He woke up gasping, his temporary VA room spinning around him as past and present collided. The walls felt like they were closing in, and every offer of help, every kind word, every second chance felt like a debt he could never repay. What if he failed them all? What if he couldn't be the man they thought he was? By sunrise, Ben had made his decision. He was leaving. Dr. Hancock found Ben's room empty at 7 a.m., his few possessions gone, except for a note written on VA stationery. "Thank you for everything. I'm not who you think I am. Please don't look for me." Doc stared at the note, recognizing the handwriting of trauma, the careful script of someone who'd learned to write reports in combat zones where clarity could mean the difference between life and death. He'd seen this before, the moment when hope became too heavy to carry, when the possibility of healing felt more terrifying than the certainty of suffering. He picked up his phone and called the one person who might be able to reach Ben before. He disappeared completely. Ghost Hamilton found Ben 3 hours later, sitting on the same concrete embankment by the river where Detective Morgan had first discovered the homeless veteran community. Ben had his worn photograph in his hands, the squad picture that had survived 2 years on the streets, and he was talking to the faces of dead men. "I told them you were heroes," Ben was saying to the photograph. "I told them what you did, what we all did. But I didn't tell them how Rodriguez cried for his mother when he was dying, didn't tell them how Williams begged me to write his girlfriend, and lie about how brave he was at the end. Didn't tell them that you all died believing I could save you." Ghost approached carefully, the way he'd learned to approach wounded animals during his years on the streets. "They died believing you'd tried your best." Ben looked up, unsurprised to see his friend. Ghost had an uncanny ability to find people who didn't want to be found, a skill that had earned him his nickname during his years of successfully avoiding arrest. "I can't do it, Ghost. I can't be their poster boy for redemption." "What happens when they figure out I'm not worth saving?" Ghost sat down beside him, his movements careful on the concrete. "You think any of us down here are worth saving? That's different. You all deserve—" "Stop!" Ghost's voice carried an authority Ben had rarely heard from him. "Just stop with the martyr bullshit. You know what Martha told me yesterday? That Vietnam nurse who's been on the streets for 12 years, she said watching you get help gave her hope that maybe she could get help too. You know what Carlos said? That seeing you stand up in that community center made him remember what it felt like to have dignity." Ben stared at the water, his grip tightening on the photograph. "What if I drink again? What if I can't handle the therapy? What if I hurt someone during a flashback?" "What if you don't?" Ghost's voice was gentler now. What if you let these people help you, and it actually works? What if your daughter gets to know who her father really is, instead of the ghost story her mother's been telling her? The mention of liberty hit Ben like a physical blow. In his jacket pocket, his phone held 17 missed calls from a Sacramento number and a voicemail he hadn't had the courage to listen to. "She called again last night," Ben whispered, "and you're going to run away instead of talking to her." Ben's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. The voicemail was time-stamped at 11:30 p.m. A 14-year-old girl staying up late to reach a father who might disappear at any moment. He played the message on speaker, and Liberty's voice filled the space between them. "Dad, Mom, told me more about when you came home from the war. She told me about the nightmares and the doctors and how hard you tried to get better. She's been crying a lot, but she also told me she never stopped loving you. I've been researching PTSD for a school project. Well, it started as a school project, but now it's just because I want to understand. I know you're scared. I know you think you're protecting me by staying away. But I'm 14, not 4. I can handle knowing my father isn't perfect. What I can't handle is not knowing him at all." Ben's vision blurred as his daughter's voice continued. "There's something else. I've been talking to some kids at school whose parents are deployed, and they all say the same thing, that their mums and dads are heroes, but also just people. People who get scared and make mistakes and sometimes need help. I think maybe you've been a hero for so long that you forgot how to be a person, but I don't need a hero, Dad. I just need you." The message ended in silence, broken only by the sound of water moving over stones and Ben's ragged breathing. 2 hours later, Mercy Adams answered her phone to hear her ex-husband's voice for the first time in 2 years. "Mercy, it's Ben. I got Liberty's message." The silence stretched between Sacramento and Riverside, filled with years of pain and misunderstanding and love that had never really died. "She wants to see you," Mercy said finally. "I'm terrified, but she wants to see you. I'm terrified too, but I think maybe that's okay. Being terrified and doing it anyway." "Where are you?" "By the river, with Ghost. Trying to decide whether to run away or come home." "You don't have a home anymore," Mercy said, and Ben's heart clenched before she continued. "But maybe you could build a new one. Maybe we all could." 3 hours later, Ben walked back into the VA hospital carrying his photograph and his fear and his friend Ghost, who'd refused to let him make the journey alone. Dr. Hancock was waiting in the lobby with Judge Washington, Detective Morgan, and Nathaniel Payne, an impromptu support team that had assembled when word spread that Ben was in crisis. "I want to try," Ben said, his voice hoarse from crying and honesty. "I want to try to get better. I want to try to be someone my daughter can be proud of. I want to try to deserve the help you're offering." Dr. Hancock smiled, understanding that the hardest part of recovery was often the decision to recover. "Then let's try together." As they walked toward the elevators, Ben felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The choice to hope instead of despair. The decision to trust in a future he couldn't, yet see but was finally willing to build. Behind them, Ghost lingered in the lobby, watching his friend choose life over mere survival. And for the first time in 5 years, he began to wonder if maybe there was hope for all of them. 6 months after that morning by the river when Ben had chosen hope over despair, he stood in the bathroom of his one-bedroom apartment, looking at himself in the mirror as he knotted a tie he hadn't worn in 3 years. The apartment was modest, subsidized housing through the county's new veterans program, but it had something Ben had forgotten he needed: a front door that locked from the inside, creating a space that belonged to him. The tie felt foreign. Against his neck, a reminder of the man he'd been before Afghanistan, before the IED, before the streets, Today marked his first day in the medical technician training program at Riverside Community College, an opportunity made possible by the network of support that had formed around his recovery. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hancock. "Remember, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up." Ben smiled, pocketing the phone. 6 months of weekly therapy sessions had taught him that showing up was often the hardest part. At the community college, Ben's hands trembled slightly as he entered the medical training lab. The antiseptic smell triggered memories he'd learned to manage but never fully escape. Field hospitals, emergency surgeries, the weight of lives in his hands. But this time, the memories carried less terror and more recognition of skills he'd thought were lost forever. "You must be Benjamin," said Dr. Patricia Chen, the program coordinator. "Welcome back to medicine." Welcome back. The words hit Ben with unexpected force. For 2 years, he'd believed that part of his life was over, that his medical training had died with his squad. But here, surrounded by equipment that felt familiar despite its civilian applications, he began to understand that healing others had always been his calling. The war had just temporarily redirected it. The other students were younger, most of them straight from high school or community college. They looked at Ben with curiosity rather than pity, seeing his age and bearing as indicators of experience rather than failure. When the instructor asked about previous medical training, Ben mentioned his military background without shame for the first time in years. "Combat medic?" asked Sarah, a 22-year-old pre-nursing student. "That's incredible. You probably know more about trauma medicine than any of us." Ben found himself sharing stories about triage protocols and field treatment procedures, his voice growing stronger as he realized his experience had value beyond the trauma it carried. That evening, Ben walked into the Riverside Veterans Advocacy office, where he'd been volunteering 3 days a week. The space buzzed with activity. Dolly Wright coordinating housing placements, caseworkers connecting veterans with services, peer counselors offering support to newly transitioned soldiers. "Ben," called Marcus Thompson, a Iraq veteran who'd entered the program 2 months after Ben. "Perfect timing. We've got a new intake who specifically asked to talk to you." The new veteran was young, maybe 25, with the hollow expression Ben recognized from his own mirror. Combat patches on his backpack indicated multiple deployments. His hands shook slightly as he filled out paperwork, a tremor Ben understood intimately. "This is David," Marcus said. "Army medic. Just got back from Syria." Ben felt something click into place as he sat across from David. For 6 months, he'd been receiving help, learning to accept support, slowly rebuilding his sense of worth. But this was different. This was his turn to offer what had been given to him. "I hear you're having trouble sleeping," Ben said, his voice carrying the easy authority of shared experience. David's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Ben's for the first time. "How did you know?" "Because 3 years ago I was sitting where you're sitting. Because I know what it's like to close your eyes and see faces you couldn't save. Because I know what it's like to come home and feel like you left the best part of yourself in a place nobody here understands." For the next hour, Ben talked. David through the early stages of transition, sharing resources, explaining how therapy worked, describing the slow process of rebuilding civilian identity. Most importantly, he offered something no caseworker or therapist could provide, proof that survival was possible. Later that week, Ben stood outside a Sacramento restaurant, his palms sweating as he checked his reflection in the window one more time. It had been 2 years since he'd seen Liberty in person, and the 14-year-old girl he remembered had become a 16-year-old young woman who'd inherited his stubborn chin and Mercy's intelligence. She spotted him first, waving from a corner booth where she sat with her mother. Ben's breath caught as he took in how much she'd grown, how much life he'd missed, But when she smiled, a genuine expression without pity or awkwardness, some of his anxiety melted away. "Dad," she said as he approached the table, the word carrying weight and hope in equal measure. "Hey, kiddo." The old nickname slipped out naturally, and Liberty's smile widened. Mercy nodded at him, her expression careful but not hostile. They'd been talking regularly for 3 months now, working through years of hurt and misunderstanding. With the help of a family therapist who specialized in military families. The conversation started awkwardly, Liberty telling him about school, her advanced placement classes, her acceptance into the National Honor Society. Ben shared updates about his training program, his volunteer work, the small apartment that was slowly becoming home. But gradually, the conversation deepened. Liberty asked about his therapy, about the nightmares, about what it was like to live on the streets. Ben answered honestly, using language appropriate for her age, but not hiding. The reality of his struggles. "I was angry at you for a long time," Liberty admitted, as they shared dessert. "Not because you were sick, but because you didn't trust me enough to let me help." "I thought I was protecting you," Ben replied. "But I was really protecting myself. From disappointing you. You can't disappoint me any more than you already have by being absent," Liberty said with the brutal honesty of teenagers. "So maybe try being present instead." The drive back to Riverside gave Ben time to process the evening. His relationship with Liberty would take time to rebuild, but the foundation was there. More importantly, she'd given him something he hadn't expected: forgiveness for his absence and permission to be imperfect in his presence. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. It was Ghost, calling from the transitional housing program he'd entered 3 weeks earlier. "How'd it go with the kid?" Ghost asked. "Good, really good. She's incredible, Ghost, smart and tough and way more mature than I was at her age." "Gets that from her old man," Ghost said, and Ben could hear the smile in his voice. "How's the program treating you?" "Day by day, brother, day by day." Ghost paused. "You know what, though? Watching you get your shit together gave me permission to try getting mine together, too." As Ben climbed the stairs to his apartment, he reflected on the strange circularity of recovery. He'd needed others to believe in him before he could believe in himself. Now his recovery was helping others find their own path forward. It wasn't the linear progression he'd expected, but something more complex and interconnected. Inside his apartment, Ben looked at the photo of his squad that now sat framed on his kitchen table instead of hidden in his wallet. The guilt was still there, but it was accompanied by something new. The understanding that surviving meant carrying their memory forward, not carrying their deaths as punishment. He had training program classes tomorrow, a therapy session with Dr. Hancock, volunteer shifts at the Veterans Center, a phone call scheduled with Liberty, small victories, each one building towards something larger. For the first time in 3 years, Ben Adams was living instead of merely surviving, and that felt like the beginning of everything. 1 year to the day after Judge Washington had discovered Ben's military service record in a routine court hearing, he stood before a different bench in the newly established Riverside County Veterans Court. But this time, he wasn't the defendant. He was the advocate, sitting beside another homeless veteran whose story mirrored his own in devastating detail. The courtroom looked different now. Gone were the harsh fluorescent lights and institutional beige walls. In their place, warm lighting illuminated displays honoring local veterans, and the American flag shared space with the POW MIA banner that reminded everyone present that some warriors never made it home. "Your Honor," Ben said, addressing Judge Washington, who had volunteered to preside over the veterans' court docket, "I'd like to speak on behalf of Sergeant Maria Santos." The woman beside him, no relation to Ben's former legal aid supervisor, was 42 years old, and had been living in her car for 8 months after losing her job as a security guard. Her arrest record showed a pattern Ben recognized: public intoxication charges that were really about self-medicating PTSD, vagrancy citations that criminalized homelessness, and escalating fines that trapped her deeper in the system. Sergeant Santos served 2 tours in Iraq with the military police, Ben continued, his voice steady and confident in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. She's struggling with trauma-related substance abuse and housing instability, but she's ready to accept help. Judge Washington nodded, her expression carrying the same dignity she'd shown Ben a year earlier. Sergeant Santos, the court is prepared to offer you a choice. You can proceed with traditional prosecution, or you can accept diversion into our Veterans Treatment Program. The program includes housing assistance, substance abuse counseling, and job placement services. Maria Santos looked at Ben with the same mixture of hope and fear he remembered feeling in this very courtroom. He leaned over and whispered, "Take the help. I know it's scary, but it works." 20 minutes later, Maria was enrolled in the program that had grown from Ben's case into a comprehensive support system serving over 50 veterans in its first year of operation. That afternoon, Ben completed his final shift as a student in the medical technician program and began his first shift as a paid employee at Riverside County Hospital. The transition felt surreal, from homeless veteran to healthcare worker in the span of 12 months, but as he clocked in and put on scrubs that carried his name and credentials, he understood that this wasn't really a transformation. It was a homecoming to the part of himself that had never truly disappeared. His supervisor, charge nurse Rebecca Torres, showed him to the emergency department where he'd be working. "Your military medical experience made you our top candidate for this position," she explained. "We need someone who can handle trauma situations and keep calm under pressure." Ben nodded, feeling the familiar weight of medical responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time, the weight felt manageable, supported by a foundation of therapy, community, and self-acceptance that hadn't existed during his years of service. His first patient was a construction worker with a deep laceration on his forearm. As Ben assisted the attending physician with sutures, his hands moved with the muscle memory of countless field treatments. But instead of triggering flashbacks, the work felt healing, a way to use his war-learned skills for peace. "Nice work," Dr. Ashley Kim told him as they finished. "You have excellent technique. Military training?" "Combat medic, special forces." Ben replied, the words carrying pride instead of shame for the first time in years. "We're lucky to have you." That evening, Ben drove to Sacramento for dinner with Mercy and Liberty, a monthly tradition they'd established as they carefully rebuilt their family relationships. The drive gave him time to process the day's events and the strange symmetry of helping another veteran in the same courtroom where his own recovery had begun. Liberty met him at the door of Mercy's house, and Ben marveled again at how much she'd grown. At 16, she was taller, more confident, and had developed a passionate interest in social justice that reminded him of both her parents at their best. "Dad, how was your first day as an actual employee instead of a student?" she asked, hugging him with the easy affection they'd rebuilt over months of careful reconnection. "Good, really good. Scary and good." Ben looked over Liberty's shoulder at Mercy, who was setting the table with the care she brought to everything. Their relationship remained complicated. They were no longer married, might never be again, but they'd found a way to be family that honored their shared love for liberty and their own healing journeys. "Liberty has news," Mercy said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and maternal concern. Over dinner, Liberty told him about her acceptance to UC Berkeley's social work program and her plan to specialize in veteran services. "Watching your recovery," Made me realize that helping people isn't just about individual therapy or casework, she explained. It's about changing systems, building communities, making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to other veterans. Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. His daughter had taken his worst failures and transformed them into motivation for service. "I'm proud of you," he managed, more proud than I know how to express. "I'm proud of you too, Dad, for getting help, for helping others, for showing me what real courage looks like." After dinner, as they walked around Mercy's neighborhood, Liberty asked the question that had been building between them for months. "Do you think you and Mom will ever get back together?" Ben glanced at Mercy, who was walking quietly beside them. They'd discussed this possibility in therapy, exploring whether their love could survive the trauma that had driven them apart. "I don't know," Ben answered honestly. "We're both different people than we were when we got married. We've been hurt in ways that changed us, but we're learning to love the people we've become, not just the people we used to be." Mercy nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Recovery isn't about going back to who we were before," she added. "It's about moving forward to who we're becoming." The drive back to Riverside took Ben through the downtown area where he'd once slept in doorways. He made a detour to visit the homeless encampment, where Ghost still helped coordinate services. For the veteran community, the camp had evolved too. It was smaller now, as more veterans found permanent housing, but better organized and more connected to support services. Ghost greeted him with a bear hug and updates on their friends. "Martha got into housing last week. Carlos started a job training program. And that kid David you've been mentoring, he's 3 months sober and just got accepted to nursing school." As Ben listened to the updates, he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. A community, healing itself, one person at a time, each recovery creating space for the next. "You know what I figured out?" Ghost said, as they sat on the familiar concrete embankment by the river. "Recovery isn't a destination, it's a practice, something you do every day, like exercise or prayer." Ben nodded, understanding that his own journey was far from over. Tomorrow, he'd go back to work, continue therapy, keep volunteering at the Veterans Center, and maintain the relationships that anchored his new life. Each day would require the same choice he'd made by the river 8 months ago: to hope instead of despair, to trust instead of isolate, to believe that his life had value beyond his trauma. The river flowed past them in the darkness, constant and unchanging, but everything else, Ben's understanding of himself, his relationship with his daughter, his place in the community, had been transformed by the recognition that healing was possible, that redemption was real, and that sometimes the most profound victories were measured not in grand gestures, but in small daily choices to keep moving forward. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vacant lot where the Benjamin Adams Memorial Veterans Center would rise, its golden rays illuminating the gathering crowd of over 300 people who had come to witness something unprecedented. In Riverside County, a community honoring not just military service, but the ongoing struggle of veterans to find their place in civilian life. Ben stood near the small platform erected for the ceremony, wearing his dress blues for the first time in 4 years. The uniform still fit, though the ribbons on his chest told a story that extended beyond his military service: a bronze star, Purple Heart, and combat medic badge, now joined by a civilian medal from the county recognizing his advocacy work with homeless veterans. "Nervous?" asked Liberty, who stood beside him in a black dress, her high school graduation pin gleaming on her lapel. She'd deferred college for a year to work with Dolly Wright's organization, gaining real-world experience before pursuing her social work degree. "Terrified," Ben admitted, his voice carrying the honesty that had become his foundation. "But the good kind of terrified, the kind that means something important is happening." Nearby, Colonel Prudence Revere checked her notes one final time. She'd flown in from San Diego specifically for this ceremony, carrying with her the weight of 15 years of guilt about losing touch with her soldiers after their discharge. Today's dedication would honor not just Ben's recovery, but her renewed commitment to the veterans she'd once led into battle. The ceremony began with the Riverside High School marching band playing the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by Judge Washington's opening remarks about how one moment of recognition in a courtroom had transformed an entire community's understanding of its responsibilities to veterans. 18 months ago, Judge Washington told the assembled crowd, I met a man I initially saw as just another homeless defendant. But Benjamin Adams taught me that sometimes the most important cases aren't about guilt or innocence. They're about recognition and redemption. She gestured toward the architectural plans displayed on easels. This center will provide housing assistance, mental health services, job training, and peer counseling for veterans throughout Riverside County. But more than that, it will serve as a reminder that military service doesn't end with discharge. It continues in the ways we care for each other in civilian life. Dr. Hancock stepped to the podium next, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom of someone who'd walked the path from trauma to healing. We named this center after Ben Adams, not because his story ended happily, but because it continues every day. Recovery isn't a destination. It's a daily practice of choosing hope over despair, connection over isolation, service over surrender. Misasu, when Colonel Revere took the microphone, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd led soldiers through combat and the humility of someone who'd learned hard lessons about leadership in peacetime. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Adams served under my command in Afghanistan, she began, her eyes finding Ben in the crowd. He was the kind of soldier every officer hopes for, skilled, dedicated, and absolutely fearless when it came to saving lives. But I failed him when he came home, just as our system failed thousands of veterans who served with honor and returned to a country that didn't know how to honor their continued service. She paused, her military bearing softening with emotion. This center represents a promise, not just to Ben, but to every veteran who wonders if their sacrifice mattered. It matters. You matter. And we will not forget you again. The colonel then read the names of Ben's fallen squad members: Rodriguez, Williams, Peterson, Martinez, Thompson, Jackson, each name echoing across the lot as a reminder that honor belongs to both the living and the dead. When Ben finally approached the podium, the crowd fell silent. For a moment he stood looking out at the faces gathered before him: Judge Washington, Detective Morgan, Martha Clark, Dolly Wright, Dr. Hancock, Ghost Hamilton, and dozens of veterans and community members whose lives had intersected with his journey. 2 years ago, Ben began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I was sleeping in doorways and believing that my life had no value beyond survival. I thought my service had ended with my discharge, that my usefulness had died. With my squad in Afghanistan, he looked toward Liberty and Mercy, who stood together near the front of the crowd. I was wrong. Service doesn't end. It evolves. The same instinct that made me a medic in combat makes me an advocate in civilian life. The same drive to protect my brothers and sisters in arms now extends to protecting veterans who are struggling to find their place in a world that often doesn't understand what they've given. Ben's voice grew stronger as he continued. This center bears my name, but it represents all of us. Every veteran who's struggled with the transition home. Every community member who's recognized that military service creates a lifelong bond of mutual responsibility. Every person who's learned that healing happens not in isolation, but in community. He gestured toward the architectural plans. These buildings will provide services, but more importantly, they'll provide recognition that military service continues in civilian life. Recognition that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. recognition that our society's strength is measured not just by the courage of those who serve, but by how we care for them when they return. As the ceremony concluded with the groundbreaking, Ben, Colonel Revere, Judge Washington and Liberty, each taking turns with a ceremonial shovel, Ben reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 18 months ago, he'd been invisible, forgotten, written off by a society that preferred not to see its struggling veterans. Today, he was at the center of a community-wide effort to ensure that no veteran would suffer alone again. The crowd began to disperse, but groups lingered, making plans for fundraising events, volunteer schedules, and advocacy efforts. Ben watched Martha Clark interview Ghost Hamilton about his own recovery journey, now 6 months into sobriety and working as a peer counselor. He saw Detective Morgan discussing the Veterans Court expansion with Nathaniel Payne, who'd left his legal aid position to become the center's first staff attorney. Liberty approached him as he stood surveying the lot that would soon become a symbol of hope for struggling veterans. "You know what I realized today, Dad?" "What's that?" "Recovery isn't just individual, it's collective. Your healing helped Mom heal from the guilt of leaving. It helped me understand what service really means. It helped this whole community become better at caring for its own." Ben nodded, understanding that his daughter had grasped something it had taken him years to learn. And it keeps going. Every veteran who gets help here will help someone else. Every person who volunteers will learn something about service. Every story shared will help someone feel less alone. As the California sun set over Riverside County, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ben Adams stood with his family and community on ground that would soon house a center dedicated to the radical idea that service continues long after uniforms are retired, that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion, recognition, and the unwavering belief that every person who serves their country deserves to be seen, supported, and honored for the rest of their lives. The Benjamin Adams Memorial Veterans Center would open its doors in 6 months, but its real work, the work of restoring dignity to the forgotten and hope to the despairing, had already begun. 5 years after the groundbreaking ceremony, Ben Adams walked through the bustling corridors of the Benjamin Adams Memorial Veterans Center, clipboard in hand, greeting staff and clients with the easy familiarity of someone who'd found his true calling. The building hummed with purposeful activity. Counseling sessions, job training programs, housing consultations, and peer support groups that had helped over 800 veterans transition from crisis to stability. "Mr. Adams," called Jessica Martinez, a young Iraq veteran completing her certification as a substance abuse counselor, "the new intake group is ready for orientation." Ben nodded, adjusting his lanyard that identified him as Director of Veteran Services. The title still felt surreal sometimes, but the work felt like home. In 5 years, he'd overseen the center's growth from a single building to a campus that included transitional housing, job training facilities, and a satellite clinic staffed by VA physicians. Walking into the orientation room, Ben saw 12 faces that mirrored his own from years past. Men and women carrying invisible wounds, uncertain about their futures, struggling to believe that recovery was possible. Among them sat a young woman who reminded him sharply of his daughter at 16, proud, scared, and fighting tears she refused to shed. "Welcome to the center," Ben began, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "My name is Ben Adams, and 5 years ago I was living on the streets, convinced that my service to my country had ended and my life had no value. I was wrong on both counts." He gestured to the photographs lining the walls, veterans who'd graduated from the program, found housing, secured employment, reconned with families. Recovery isn't a destination you reach and then you're done. It's a practice you commit to every day. Some days are harder than others, but none of us has to face those days alone. After the session, Ben found Ghost Hamilton in the peer counseling office, working with a Navy veteran struggling with alcohol dependency. Ghost had become the center's most effective counselor, using his street credibility and hard-won sobriety to reach veterans who didn't trust traditional therapists. "How's the new crop?" Ghost asked, looking up from his case files. "Promising. Scared, but promising." Ben settled into the chair across from his friend's desk. "The young woman in the back, Rachel. She reminds me of Liberty at that age. All tough exterior protecting a heart that's been broken too many times." Through the office window, Ben could see Judge Washington conducting a hearing in the on-site Veterans Court, a program that had expanded to serve 3 counties and become a model for judicial systems nationwide. Detective Morgan, now captain. Morgan supervised the specialized Veterans Outreach Unit that had reduced veteran arrests by 70%. Liberty appeared in the doorway, now 21, and carrying the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose early. She'd graduated college with honors and returned to Riverside to work as the center's community outreach coordinator, bridging the gap between veteran services and civilian understanding. "Dad, the documentary crew wants to do final interviews," she said. "The piece about veteran homelessness and community response is airing next month." Ben smiled, thinking about how far they'd all traveled from that morning in Judge Washington's courtroom. Martha Clark's story had sparked a movement that spread far beyond Riverside County, inspiring similar programs in dozens of communities across the country. That evening, as Ben locked the center's doors, he reflected on the strange mathematics of recovery. One moment of recognition had multiplied into thousands of moments of healing. One veteran's journey had become a roadmap for countless others. One community's choice to see rather than ignore had transformed how an entire region cared for its most vulnerable heroes. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hancock, now in his 80s, but still mentoring young therapists. "Proud of you, son. Your squad would be proud too." Ben looked up at the stars appearing in the California sky, thinking of Rodriguez, Williams, Peterson, Martinez, Thompson, and Jackson. Their sacrifice had given his survival meaning, and his survival had given their memory purpose. The Benjamin Adams Memorial Veterans Center would continue its work long after Ben retired, serving as proof that honor restored could create honor for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.